Welcome to the UrbanEV Podcast, the show where we explore the future of electric mobility through real stories, bold innovation, and expert insight. I'm your host, Rob Hoffman.
And I'm Scott Murphy.
Today, we're joined by Nigel Gordon Stewart, Chairman and CEO of the legendary Austin Motor Company. With decades of experience at the helm of global automotive brands, Nigel is now steering a century-old icon into the EV era with the Austin Aero, the company's first new car in over 30 years. We'll also dive into Project Aero, Canada's ambitious all-electric vehicle initiative, where Nigel sits on the board. From legacy to the leading edge, this conversation covers what it takes to build and rebuild the future of driving. Nigel, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much indeed, gentlemen. Great to see you.
So, Nigel, you've got quite the past here in the automotive world. Why don't you tell us about how you got your start at it?
It was a conversation that took place after I left school. I joined the army, and I was in the British Army for a while. And for various different reasons, it wasn't going in the direction I wanted it to. It sounds strange, but there's nothing particularly suspicious about that. It just wasn't, and I wasn't enjoying it as a career. And I was walking down a street in London, central London, actually in Mayfair, and it's called Berkeley Street, and it's where all the car companies are, all the kind of high end car companies. And I bumped into somebody who used to be in the same regiment as me, and he said, "Oh, it's good to see you. What are your plans?" And I said, "Well, I think it's time for me to leave." And he said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, that's the issue. I really don't know." And he said, "But you've always talked about cars. You've got a thing about cars. You're kind of passionate about it." And I said, "Yeah, that's true." And he said, "Well, look, there's a showroom right here. Just walk in and ask for a job." And I said, "Okay, that sounds a little bit brave, but I'll give it a go." So I walked in and I spoke, and it was a Rolls-Royce Bentley showroom.
All right, so there you go. So there's where it was a stretch there. You're shooting for the stars.
Yeah, absolutely. It was Rolls-Royce Bentley, and it was also Austin Rover at the time. So ARG Group, I was called Austin Rover Group at the time. And I went in and I spoke to one of the salesmen. And I said, "Could I speak to the general manager?" And they said, "Yes, we'll go and get him." And I went and saw him, and his name was Jeffrey Stiles. I'll never forget it till this day. And this is a long time ago. And he said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, could I have a job, please?" And he said, "What have you been doing up until now?" And I said, I've been a British Army officer." And he said, "Oh, what regiment were you in?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh, can you start next week?" So I mean, it was old school tie. It was really, he didn't ask me what my qualifications were or anything else at all. He just liked the fact that I'd been a British cavalry officer and said, "Fine, can you start next week?" And that's how I started. So I started there, went on to BMW, and then became sales manager of a dealership, and then the general manager of that dealership. And we started messing around with some nice sort of upmarket product. So we were selling Porsche, we were selling some Ferrari, and I started selling a few Lamborghinis at the time, which was they were fairly rare things. This is Countach, and this is late 80s, so it was quite a while ago.
For the record, Nigel, that was my all-time dream car growing up. The Countach was it.
Countach was a bit special. That's when Lamborghini was Lamborghini, and we'll get onto that in a minute. And anyway, so we started selling a few of those, and the guy who owned the Lamborghini importership for the UK contacted me and said, "Look, you seem to be doing rather better than we are. Is there any possibility you'd come and join us?" So I went and started working for a place called Portman Lamborghini, which is based in London, no longer there. And from that, literally my career just sort of grew from there, and I ended up joining McLaren. I was responsible for the McLaren F1 sales, which was kind of the most extraordinary, working with Gordon Murray and working with Peter Stevens and Ron Dennis and some absolute luminaries. And then went from there to work for Lamborghini over in Italy, where I became sales and marketing director over there, and on and on and on it goes. And the list of names is horrific, or great, depending on on your view on automotive.
So that's quite a storied history you have, but eventually you ended up at the Austin Motor Company. So why don't you tell us about how that transition took place?
The electric assisted vehicles was the company that I met Scott. We were working on something very specific. And I think at the time we all, and still do, very much agree with the fact that the principal concentration of electric vehicles really should be urban and focused on the urban environment, because if you need to clean anything up, it's the urban environment. And initially it needed to be emissions. That was the key issue. We still have a number of cities all over the world that are unfortunately smog bound and struggling very heavily with emissions coming from internal combustion engines. I think at the time, Scott and I were looking at it in a very similar way, which is if we can get these vehicles out of the city and we can actually reduce the bulk of these vehicles that are being used, especially as light commercial vehicles, what we could actually do is free cities up. They could become much more entertaining and much more enjoyable. And we developed this lightweight pedelec vehicle, which was capable of carrying around about 500 kilos, so about half a ton. It was a vehicle that we developed with a passion. Perhaps we probably should have put a little bit more science into it, shall we say, Scott?
We don't have to mention any of that. This thing was a workhorse. It took a beating, but it was a machine.
And anyway, so we developed this vehicle, and it actually went pretty well. We started to build the business up. It was very much a nascent market, so we were kind of working pretty hard to build that up. We had vehicles in New York, and we had vehicles in as far as wide as Australia. We had some in South Africa. We had them dotted around Europe. We had some very interesting conversations with companies like Renault, who were very interested in what we were doing. But the problem is, as with all these kind of startups, especially around that time, and especially in this particular sector, you are always sitting there with the begging bowl in your hand saying, we need to raise more money, we need to raise more money. And we got to the point where eventually we were able to raise money, but the company that invested wanted to change the board of directors. So in that particular situation, it was, thanks ever so much for everything you've done so far, but don't let the door hit you in the arse on the way out. So that was kind of the end of that, and I was looking for another opportunity, and somebody turned around to me and said, "Look, I need to introduce you to this guy." Slightly interesting story. He had looked at the idea of developing a vehicle around about 10 years ago, about 2015, and he was looking for a brand. And somebody had said, "Well, have a look online and see what brands might be available." And he started with A, as you would. Makes perfect sense. As he's running down the list of hang on a second, this is Austin Motor Company. This appears to be available. And he did all his checks. That company was acquired, or the brand was acquired, as part of a portfolio of brands that was acquired by the Shanghai Automotive International Corporation, SAIC, and Nanjing Automotive back in 2000 and whatever, not a lot. When that company, when MG Rover Group went pop, and went into administration, and SAIC and Nanjing bought everything. And Austin was one of the brands. There were a number of others that were kind of within there. And they obviously gave it to a trademark attorney and said, look after these, because these are little nuggets of IP that we own. But as somebody said to me earlier today, and we were having an interesting conversation, Chinese and brands, it's a weird thing. They don't get it.
Yeah, they don't care.
The Chinese,
no, they don't care.
They do not get it. They just don't get it. And whereas sophisticated, perhaps more mature markets, such as Europe, such as the US, we are heavily brand focused. We actually subscribe a lot of value to the brand that's being communicated to you. Anyway, so he managed to get hold of that. It cost him the princely sum of £175 to register it. He then registered all the trademarks, and at one point the people representing SAIC turned around and said, "Oh, hang on a second, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, you let it go, you kind of let it fall through the net," which is what they did. So he was able to actually secure the whole thing, and then they started off with a fairly long gestation period for this little Austin Aero. But the Aero was based on what's called the L7E platform, which is basically an electric quadricycle. And it means that you don't have to go through extensive crash testing and other type approval processes. It has a restricted speed. It has a restricted, not range as such, but certainly in terms of the actual performance of the vehicle, it's fairly restricted, but it's still really enjoyable. And if you put that into a vehicle which essentially looks like an Austin 7, you have something that performed like an Austin 7 did back in the day. In fact, probably even better. Just super exciting. And with a whole kind of retro feel.
I mean, to be honest, that was what was fascinating to me about it, aside from the coolness of the Austin Motor Company, the look of the vehicle and everything, is that it is a quadricycle. I mean, it's not a car. And I think that allows you to build the vehicle that you're building. Yeah, but it allows you to get to even the look and feel that you want to achieve with the Austin 7. You wouldn't have been able to achieve that with a standard car chassis. No, not easily anyway.
With an internal combustion engine, you would have had all kinds of issues that you would have had to have addressed. You would have had to address, I mean, first of all, you would have to have gone for something like low volume type approval for Europe, which is actually a fairly complicated process. You would have had to have gone for the emissions process with an internal combustion engine, which would have been long and fairly arduous. Yes, you could have probably done it by working with a donor engine company, so that you could have got an engine from Ford Motor Company or one of the others. But again, you still have to go through the process of making sure that all the heat is removed from the car and it doesn't overheat and doesn't have all kinds of problems and this, that, and the other. The interesting thing about EV is that actually what it has allowed, which is which is strange because people are almost objecting to it. It's allowed you to get a car to market much quicker than you ever could have done before, because you don't have to go through that extensive type approval process. Yes, you have to still do crash tests, and yes, and certainly in the States, you have to do self-certification, 30 degree, you have to do inverted and drop it and all this kind of stuff. But actually, that's much more controllable when you've got batteries inside a battery compartment, as opposed to burning hot, red hot exhaust pipes within 3 or 4 feet of a fuel tank. That usually goes wrong. if you mix those two, they don't work very well together. And people make this big thing about EVs and the possibility of thermal runaway, and it happens so rarely. It's just fossil fuel kind of scaremongering to basically say, oh, it's much better if you're burning stuff, it's much better. And it isn't. You can actually make better cars if you use electric. It works better. It's actually a better solution. So says a petrol head, by the way.
My next big question, I filled out the pre-registration and requested a quote today.
Saw that.
When can we start driving these things?
In Spain, very, very soon. I mean, we can get a car down to Spain relatively quickly, so that's not too much of a problem. US, if I'm being brutally honest with you, I'm waiting for all this hoo-ha to die down, because, 1 minute it's this,
and now
then
you've
it's
got
that.
the tariffs on top of that.
Yeah, which is bonkers, because the truth of it is, I mean, I don't want to get into too much of a big subject on it, but we are, as a manufacturer, we are absolutely no threat whatsoever to the American automotive manufacturing industry. In fact, what would be easier for us and what would be much more financially efficient for us would be for us to actually supply a whole load of parts, and both a combination of from overseas and also secure parts locally, and actually set up a local supply chain and assemble them. Not manufacture as such, because manufacturing is much more complex. But what we could easily do is assemble them over in the US, and that would make perfect sense. The ridiculous thing is, if we did that under the current regime, we'd still have to pay tariffs on the parts that came in, and we'd still have to pay a tariff on the completed car. That makes no sense. We'd actually probably end up being able to employ 50 to 100 people in the US to actually put these things together, but actually it's prohibitive. So we're just going to sit here and wait and just see what happens.
It's amazing now.
See if he does the sensible thing, just goes off and plays golf somewhere and leaves us all alone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, last I checked, free and open market economies do better. Basically, we cast retaliatory tariffs against the UK, apparently.
Well, no, we
not
do.
even
I mean,
equal.
it's always been a bit of an issue. And as much as, back in the day, there's lots of us who kind of wanted to import or did import American cars just for a bit of fun. And there was a 10% tariff that was always payable on those cars importing them from the US. Now, the difference was that obviously the dollar back in those days was a lot weaker, and therefore the car was coming in relatively cheaply. So putting a 10% tariff on it was not too uncomfortable. And we knew that people in the States were able to buy cars quite cheaply. The other side of it was, of course, that a lot of American companies, auto manufacturers, decided not to invest in right-hand drive development. So because of that, you could only bring a car in as a left-hand drive. And I've owned left-hand drives and right-hand drive cars in this country, which is obviously a right-hand drive country, and it's okay, but you can get bored of it very, very quickly, especially when you're driving down a country lane and you're trying to see around the car to see if you can overtake.
Yeah.
It probably gets old in a hurry. Yeah. The novelty wears off after about one Sunday afternoon drive.
Because the poor passenger is now being sort of put out into the path of this oncoming vehicle, and you're speaking to the passenger saying, "Can you just tell me if anything's coming?" And I go, "Why am I doing this? This is ridiculous." So actually, as far as the UK is concerned, we have a bona fide reason why really we haven't imported as many US cars as we'd like to. And I have to be honest, I was over in the States relatively recently. I was in Miami for a while with some business meetings there to talk about Austin, actually. And I hired an American car to drive around, and it was a Dodge Charger I had for a bit. It was all right. It was absolutely fine. I always had a bit of a thing about the Lincoln Navigator, which I thought was a great car, the latest version of it. It's a nice piece of kit. And if you said to me, you've got the choice between having a Range Rover or having a Lincoln Navigator, what would I have? I'd have a Lincoln, to be honest with you, because it just seemed like a more fun car to have. You don't produce that car in right-hand drive, so there's no point in having one over here.
Generally speaking, American cars just don't fit very well in Europe or the UK. They're generally obviously bigger.
Yes and no.
They just don't fit.
We've got the Mustang now as a right-hand drive. We've got the Corvette, the latest Corvette as a right-hand drive, and they are exceptional cars. As far as I'm concerned, a big V8, 5-litre V8 It doesn't seem the most sensible thing in the world, especially as the what's the smaller engine? It's they've got in there. It's the EcoBoost. It's fantastic. I mean, a really good engine because they've now got forced induction with things like really clever turbochargers. That means you don't have turbo lag and you can actually drive the car really well. Brilliant. There's lots and lots of right-hand drive Mustangs over here, and people are just starting to take delivery of their Corvettes as well. So it's great. So we do embrace American cars if we're given the opportunity, especially the good ones. But they aren't, it's the same as every manufacturer. There's good ones and bad ones. Some of them are horrible.
Of course,
Yeah.
We've got all different flavors over here. But Nigel, I want to take a step backwards right now because we're talking about the Aero, and you mentioned it's based on a quadricycle frame or platform. Can you explain to everyone at home what that really means? Does it have pedals? Yeah. What's the speed limitation? What does that really mean?
It starts off with a weight restriction. So there is a weight restriction. You can't make it, big and heavy because obviously quadricycles are not designed to be big and heavy. There's a power output. So we have a 15 kilowatt motor in it. That's as far as we can go. We have a limitation on performance. So we can go to around about 60 miles an hour, which is about 100 kilometers an hour. That's our limitation on that. And there are specific technical limitations on performance. And obviously if weight is an issue, then obviously battery pack is an issue. We can't over battery the car because obviously that then reduces the range, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to get a sensible sort of balance. But these kind of micro cars or city cars like the Citroen Ami, the Renault Twizy, these are cars that have been developed to try and impact the urban vehicle market, which is, and I find it absolutely extraordinary that I go up to London and I go to places, really nice places like Chelsea and Knightsbridge and Kensington and places like this, which are beautiful parts of the city. But I sit in a traffic jam and I've got an enormous Range Rover in front of me and an enormous Mercedes G63 behind me. And I'm thinking, there's a 20 mile an hour speed limit, blanket speed limit in London. How does that make any sense whatsoever? But then I have to kind of realize something. And this is kind of the key point, and Scott, I think you'll back me up on this. None of this ever makes any sense. If you could sit down with someone and say, tell me what your use of your motor car is, right? Take me through an average week, take me through an average month, do the whole thing. Give me details. Tell me how much you're using your car for. And then put that use case against what actually they're driving, and you'll find that there's a complete disconnect. There is no point in having a Range Rover Vogue long wheelbase when basically you're taking the kids from school in Kensington to your house, which is a mile and a half away. It makes no sense. What you should be doing is using something small and something efficient. I'm not saying take comfort away. If you want to be comfortable, I'm not asking you to to sit there with the wind howling around your face. I'm saying, put you in something that makes sense, an urban car that's enjoyable. But equally, that's all you need for living in a city. You do not need one of these big 4x4s. And yet all the OEMs have gone hell for leather making these enormous, great big cars.
Yeah.
I don't get
and
it.
bigger and bigger as they can. And Rob's a guilty culprit in this mix with his fucking huge third row seat Kia.
I need the third row. I do.
You need the third row.
But but is that an EV9 or is that a?
Yeah,
I have the EV9. Yeah.
Listen, the EV9, I cannot believe how good a car that is.
It's a great car.
Yeah. No, it's a great car.
It's a fantastic car. Yes, it's big and heavy and all the rest of it. But the bottom line of it is, if you want to take all the kids and the family and you want to put some stuff in the trunk and what have you, it does the job incredibly well. But the most important thing is, all I'm not interested in, because you have all the stories of, where does cobalt come from? Where does lithium come from? All this kind of stuff with all this kind of, whipped up stories about how hideous, EVs are and what have you. But the bottom line is that what's coming out the tailpipe is nothing. And where that is so important is within a city or within a town. You're not choking everybody. I can sit behind an EV and breathe happily. Funny thing, I went to, my son was over recently from Canada because he's based up in Montreal. And we went up to London just to go and have a wander around some museums and stuff because he was around. And it was quite a nice day, early part of the year. And there was an ice cream van, as we have here in the UK, which is basically just a Sprinter, Mercedes Sprinter. And the back is converted to basically sell people ice creams out the side window. And this is the first one I've seen that was completely EV. And,
wow.
Everyone was standing around it, basically queuing up to buy an ice cream and all this kind of stuff. and I thought to myself, at last, it makes perfect sense. A number of times I've stood by an ice cream van queuing up for an ice cream on a hot day with diesel smoke belching out of an exhaust pipe that's basically running a Jenny on board. Yeah. It's like, it just makes you wonder just how intelligent people truly are. Because so many people just don't seem
All
to
this
get it.
stuff makes, we all know the transition to EV makes perfect sense. But you had brought up something that's very interesting, which I think many people have been aware of for a long time. You look at the advertising for Range Rover or any kind of luxury SUV type vehicle, and it's always these images of exploring deserts, mountains, wilderness, doing stuff that 98% of these drivers will not do. It's their fantasy, and that's part of the image. And, you know, when you're pulling up to pick up your kids in Kensington, you still look pretty cool in that Range Rover. But your car, you know, and then I've been to Europe a bunch of times over the years, and I've seen those Renault Amis and those tiny little micro cars, which seem very popular. It would make sense here in our urban environment. They just haven't really caught on the smart car. You see them once in a while, Fiat 500 a little bit. They're never really super popular. So there's this kind of combination here of car that makes sense and a car that's sexy or cool or really enhances my image. But your Aero, the Austin Aero, I think you check a lot of boxes over there. The style of that vehicle, and you've got the credibility to pull it off because you are a brand that actually built the original. It's not so much derivative. This is
Absolutely. Yeah,
the
yeah,
brand's
absolutely right.
design.
I think that's one of the key things, actually, is the
Yeah,
fact that
and I
we do
think
have the brand and we're able to use that brand, but also because of the fact that people are starting to see EVs as being an inconvenience, a kind of like, it's almost like a grudge choice. Oh God, I've got to buy an EV or whatever. And actually, that's what they shouldn't be thinking. That the flexibility, the ability, the performance that you're able to get from an electric motor is fantastic. Its efficiency is actually incredibly high. We're not losing lots and lots of energy in terms of heat dissipating all over the place that you get from burning stuff. It actually is an extraordinarily efficient. And it's unfortunately we're going through this transition period, and I think that's where the issue is. And Scott and I have spoken about this a lot. The biggest problem that we had was getting people to change. Right?
Yeah.
They could turn around and say, yeah, that makes sense. And all the efficiencies are there. And we can actually look at how many packages we can put on board this vehicle and how long it takes to get from A to B and all this kind of stuff. We even sat down and had a trial with the London ambulance service. And the London ambulance service worked out that they could get to I think they gave them categories, and it was kind of like a kind of mid-category incident where somebody was having a heart attack, for example. You could get there quicker on one of our vehicles by a considerable margin than you could by an ambulance. So therefore, you would be saving lives by using these lightweight, urban vehicles. However, people were pouring scorn upon them. They were turning around and saying, "Oh, what's wrong, guys? Can't you afford to buy a new ambulance because you're having to run around in these things?" Change is the biggest.
And this is when you were at EAV, correct,
yes, at EAV,
Nigel? Just to put things
absolutely,
okay.
Yeah, and
All right.
that change of culture, getting people to accept that it is not just necessary from an environmental and a sustainability point of view to move across to electric vehicles, but actually electric vehicles can be massively more efficient and more successful, and with the Austin Aero, more enjoyable. We've actually made a car that is just absolutely brilliant fun. I mean, it's bonkers, but it's brilliant fun.
It looks so awesome. It looks so cool. I mean, I hope someday when I visit London, you'll give me the opportunity to drive one.
Listen, you're more than welcome.
That car's instantly a dream car of mine.
Yeah, it's an absolute hoot.
Can you talk to us about the specs, though? The range, the battery size, and the performance.
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me stuff like this, and I need to kind of pull up some stuff on the screen if I'm going to give you specs and stuff. Yeah, you've got a 96 volt, 20 kilowatt hour lithium ion battery in it. You've got a 15 kilowatt motor in it. We're doing 0 to 60 miles an hour in 7.8 seconds, which I will tell you sounds pretty slow these days. But if you compare it to what we were driving in the 80s, and there were some BMW M3 Evos and stuff, if they were doing 7.8 seconds to 60, you were like, whoop, whoop, this is really impressive stuff. The whole thing weighs 440 kilos, 445 kilos, plus the battery pack's about 160 kgs. So, all in, we're like 600 kgs.
That's wonderful. Listen, it reminds me of the Mazda Miata from my heyday of driving in the 80s. That car was not the fastest car, but it was an open air roadster. And it was amazingly fun to drive. A friend of mine had one. The car was absolutely incredible. No, it wasn't going to beat every other performance car in a drag race, but it didn't matter. And it really caught on. And I feel like, your Aero has that potential.
If you wind the conversation back to the conversation we were having just a few minutes ago about the the soccer mum or whatever you want to call her, who's basically, picking up the kids and taking them to school, 1.5 miles down the road. Is there any enjoyment in that experience? Is there any enjoyment in getting the kids in the back of the Range Rover, belting them in, getting in the front, and then just moving out and sticking in traffic with everybody else just chugging around? Yeah, you're a bit more comfortable and you can turn the AC on, but you can get that on a car that costs a fraction of what that thing's costing. And, if you're doing 1.5 miles, just what's the point? What I wanted to, and where we were going with EVs, to a certain extent, because I think Tesla has been such a leader in the sort of first mover advantage in this particular area, that they started to produce something which, because of the mentality of the business, became more and more and more like an appliance and less like a car. The first Roadster they produced, I mean, I was at Lotus when we did that, and the car was bonkers, and we were all laughing about how many, sort of foam batteries were being put in the chassis to make this thing go. And they were using the Lotus Europa chassis, and it was kind of a really big, brave move by Martin Eberhard and Musk at the time to actually, later on Musk, to kind of do that. But actually, the idea of starting that out as a halo car, saying to people, this is an EV and it's kind of really good fun. Look at the benefits you're going to get. You're going to get bonkers acceleration, which is fantastic. And you can really enjoy that kind of real essence of performance. But then, of course, you start to deal with early battery technology. So you had weight, you had all kinds of, reduced range. You had problems with charging because of the heat side of things. All these kind of things hadn't been solved. But it was a fun car. And if you've ever driven a Tesla Roadster, they're just like kind of woohoo. I mean, it's just great. But then as you move into the Model S and the Model Y, and they have just become, they're just appliances. And that's where I have the issue, is that we've lost that kind of that wonderful character that existed in these cars. And look at the stuff coming from China. I mean, if literally they could kind of build a car and then bleed all the personality out of it before they stuck it on a transporter, that's what they've done. There is no personality in these cars at all. It used to be that a car
they all
said
look the
something
same.
about you. Yeah, it used to be that a car used to say something about you. You used to sit down with your friends and they say, "Oh, what you're driving now?" And you turn around and say what it was. Yeah, that's really cool. But if you turn around and say what you're driving now, oh, I'm driving a BYD. They go, oh yeah, and that to me just ruins the whole point of driving, because driving to me is still a really enjoyable thing. I love it. You get behind the wheel of something that you can control, that you can drive, that it's an immersive experience. Why would you want to bleed the personality out of that? So you've just got a washing machine or a dishwasher or a microwave on wheels.
Well, Nigel, you brought up something interesting before about how the Chinese bought the brand names here for Austin, but don't fully understand the branding aspect of what that really means to the consumer in the Western country like the UK. But I feel like maybe there's a disconnect also between Western brands and what speaks to the Chinese consumer. Now, obviously, BYD, if we're paying attention, what's going on over there, they're building a factory right now. It's larger than Manhattan. It's incredible. Their mega factories are on a scale that's never been seen before. So the European brands we all know are nosediving over there. Volkswagen, Porsche, those used to be they were printing money over there in China. Now it's the exact opposite. We don't have any experience with BYDs in the States. They've been effectively shut out. Tell me more about you. I'm just curious about your experience about BYD in UK. They are sold over there, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. They did some very very intelligent, clever marketing. They marketed the car at some key English soccer players, who are superstars in the English Premier League, and they were given cars. They were told they were buying them, but giving them, and that kind of created a good image. I mean, we are very good at marketing car brands because we've been doing it a long time over here in Europe, and you've been doing it a long time in the States. We're very, very good at marketing these things. If we're given brands to work with, BYD is making quite a significant impact. I went past where was I? I was driving north somewhere here in the UK, and I went past quite a big city, Midlands, sort of towards the north, and there was a huge, what was originally a huge Mercedes-Benz dealership, which was had Mercedes-Benz AMG on it, massive. And now on the other side of it, they've divided it in half, and one is Mercedes-Benz and the other side is BYD. but it's a wonderful glass house. It's an absolute gym palace of a showroom. So they've kind of gone, okay, we get it. We need to kind of market these cars effectively and in such a way that it works for the European public to buy into this. So they're doing that very intelligently, and it's working very, very well. BYD is also driven by price. Their price points in China are just insane. I mean, they can produce
Well, they're
cars so
subsidized.
cheaply.
Yeah, that helps.
Well, it's not only subsidized, but how much they pay a Chinese worker is nowhere near what you would expect to receive in the Rust Belt in the US, for example, which is the reason why Donald's bonkers idea about tariffs and let's make America great again. I don't think America ever was anything but great. I don't know why he's talking it down, because I've always loved the US. I think it's fantastic. I used to live in Jacksonville in Florida. I lived in Atlanta for a while when I worked for Lotus. I spent a lot of time over in LA, and I've had that wonderful experience of having driven from New York down to right the way down to Miami. I've driven from Atlanta right the way across to Los Angeles. I've spent a lot of time in the US, and it's a great, great, great country. Love it. Absolutely love it. So I don't know what this Make America Great thing is, again, by being protectionist, because it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when you're up against an international market, which is putting the price of these, I say, appliance type vehicles is going down and down and down and down and down. And don't forget, we haven't even touched on new battery technology yet. We're still lithium ion. We're getting better performance out of these batteries, but geez, what's coming down the pipe with new battery technology is insane. It's going to make such a difference.
Solid state looks like it's actually really going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Once it's scalable, I mean, we know that solid state's possible, but it's the scalability of it. Once that's scalable, you're talking about being able to drive into the equivalent of a gas station. And instead of getting the pump out and just standing there and holding the trigger or clipping it on so you can literally put, I don't know how many gallons in a car. For us, it's probably around about 80 liters. So whatever that is in gallons, however long that takes, about 5 minutes. Right. And then you walk inside the gas station and say, I'll have a couple of Hershey bars or whatever it happens to be. And you buy some really unhealthy, you should take from the car and eat it on the way home. The idea is that
I see America's rubbed off on you really well from your time over here.
We do it really well. But you'll have exactly the same situation with new battery technology. You'll graphene and what have you. You will literally drive in, you'll plug the thing in, you'll stand there watching where it kind of ticks over on your mobile phone or your watch or whatever it happens to be. Your car will be filled to 80%, and you'll just put the thing, but you'll walk back in and go and buy your Hershey bars or whatever, get back in your car, and it'll say you've got 1,000 kilometers or 500 miles of range on there. What is not to like?
It's, you recognize that BYD maybe is a bit of a soulless car. It's more of an appliance, but this is where they really, really have leaned into the technology side of things, and it's incredible where they are right now today. They just announced there's a sedan.
The Gigawatt.
Yep, it's the Han L. I don't know if it's going to be available in the UK. It's certainly available in China. Yeah, it basically can handle a gigawatt of charging speed. It's got 2 ports because these gigawatt chargers don't even exist yet. So you can plug it in on both sides, and you can get 250 miles of range in 5 minutes charge. So, those are the kind of numbers that will get a lot of people on board, even if the car doesn't have as much character as a European brand. It's going to speak to consumers.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese have done a fantastic job in terms of taking the technology opportunity of electric vehicles and accelerating it beyond anything that any of the other OEMs in the world could even have thought about. And we probably all had a drive of a Porsche Taycan, and we've gone, yeah, this is kind of cool. And yes, you leave your internal organs behind when you hit the button really hard and all the rest of it. It's really, really impressive stuff. But that's an expensive motor car. That's a really expensive motor car, and actually, the resale value, the residual values on that have just plummeted, absolutely plummeted.
Oh yeah, 50%. They're the worst. Yeah,
because you can still buy the same amount of performance from a Chinese car for a quarter of the money. So how does that work?
Well, and I think if you think about what's the priority for the Chinese consumer, it's features, 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 features. They don't care about personality. They care about range to a certain extent, and they care about features. And this makes me think about, you talk about a car as an appliance. This makes me think about my time when I was at Sears, and Samsung came out with this refrigerator that it had a feature in it where if you put your dozen eggs in there, and you could say, okay, as soon as there's no more eggs in here, order me more eggs. And so this seemed like the
Yeah.
greatest thing in the world, right? But what would happen is these moms would take this carton of eggs out every morning to make eggs for their kids, and the refrigerator would order another dozen eggs. They'd put it back, another dozen would show up. The next morning, the same thing would happen over and over and over again. How much
And
do
this,
people
and
really
this is
care
this
about
is
these
why
crazy?
this is why there's an egg
Yeah,
shortage
there's
in
an
the
egg
States.
shortage. Yeah, exactly. The fucking Samsung
Now we
It's nothing to
refrigerator.
do with avian flu at all. It's just to do with Samsung refrigerators.
But the comedy of the whole thing was these were features nobody ever even asked for, and I think I often wonder, especially with BYD, if it's just sometimes just features for feature's sake, and again, if the personality of the car is even going to become more important as that becomes less relevant, as these stupid features make no sense. One thing that struck me about what you guys are building is it's just a cool car. Like if it had a petrol engine, maybe some car heads would get more excited about it, but it's just a cool car. And the fact that it's EV makes it even more exciting for those of us who are on the EV side of things.
So, I mean, everybody's trying to look in their crystal ball. Every single OEM I can think of has got a new department called the crystal ball department. And they're all kind of sitting around looking at this thing that's sitting in the middle of a table going, where do we go with this? We don't know what to do. You know, we've been making internal combustion engines for all this time, and we've invested so much money in it, and now we don't know what to do. And the Chinese are on our doorstep, and the only way we can stop them being here is by tariffing their arse off, because that's the only way we can actually deal with it. But one of the things that's really key to me is the fact that we're kind of de-evolving the automobile. Okay, with an internal combustion engine, we've taken it to such a level, such an advanced level. There is more computing power in literally one headlamp in a Range Rover than there is, or than was needed to take Apollo to the moon, for crying out loud. It is just madness in terms of that kind of technical sophistication. So we get to this point, we introduce electric to that, and we continue with all the features, as you said, Scott. Features. You know, we want to have screens everywhere, because we're all believing Apples and iPads and iPhones and Samsungs and God knows what these days, and nobody uses anything that requires turning a knob anymore. So we've lost that kind of analog feel to things. And actually, electric takes even more of that analog feel away. So one of the vehicles that we've got planned for the future is actually an electric vehicle with a 4-speed crash gearbox. You are going to have to crash through the gearbox to drive it. You want to go faster?
That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
But technically, you lose efficiency with that, right? So it's much more of a feel thing and an on-brand type.
Yeah,
of
but
product,
like I'm not
right?
mad about that. Like you bring a little bit of fun
either.
back
I think
into
it's cool.
this. Like,
I miss driving a stick.
Yeah,
I miss driving a standard.
Yeah, you lose efficiency from not being able to drive it efficiently. But if you're driving the balls off the thing, it doesn't make any difference anyway. Because, you know, we've all sat there on the freeway and we're driving along, you know, in our internal combustion engine cars, and we're kind of observing the speed limit. So we're doing 70 miles an hour. And then some lunatic in a Kia EV9 goes past us at like sort of 95. And you think, you bought that car to be kind of more involved in the sort of environmental sustainability side of things. And here's you driving at 95 miles an hour. I mean, I've been overtaken by so many people going flat out in Teslas. It's just unbelievable. But it just kind of makes the whole thing a bit of a farce, really. It doesn't make any sense. Nobody's conserving energy because they've just filled their car up with it.
I mean, listen, you get a Plaid, you're going to have some fun with it.
Yeah, they're
bashing
the
the
shit out of it.
accelerator.
Energy, why do I need to conserve that? I'm just going to use it. It just comes from the stars. We can do whatever we like with it. So, you know, and there is a long path for people to go through to get to the point of saying, yes, we need to be a more environmental. Yes, we need to be more sustainable. Right? Give me something I can still enjoy. Don't take my enjoy of motoring away, please. Give me something that's fun. Okay, fair enough. We can do that. All right. But the bottom line of it is that at some point we need to start conserving energy itself and just not using it as consumers do, as without any regulation whatsoever, because it's just wasteful. And we're such a wasteful species anyway. We're bloody awful at it.
This is a perfect transition. So stepping away from Austin for a second and just, you know, similar names, different situation altogether. Talk about Project Aero in Canada. Tell us what you're doing there. I know you're on the board, but what's going on there? It's the first I've heard of it.
There's a fantastic organization led by a delightful gentleman by the name of Flavio Volpe, who's the president of the Auto Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada, or the APMA. And He is responsible for kind of representing all the auto parts manufacturers in Canada. So his life at the moment is hell on this planet. It's
Whoa,
absolutely
yeah, he's
awful.
definitely in the hot seat right now.
He is in the hot seat. So he's spending half his time running around with Mark Carney and half the time running around with Doug Ford and all this kind of stuff, and trying to keep the various different provinces, especially Ontario, just basically relatively balanced, because they're having to shut down or literally put factories on reduced time to reduce production because of this 25% madness that's going on that doesn't make any sense. For 106 years, I think it is, the Americans and Canadians have worked together to build cars with almost a non-existent border. Bits were going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and Canadians were buying Fords and GMs and what have you, and so were Americans. No big deal. And all of a sudden, Trump sort of looks at Detroit and says, okay, that's gone to shit. We need to kind of fix Detroit and have that making all the cars for America again, which is entirely protectionist. But as Flavio says, it's so difficult to unscramble the omelette. These two organizations, these two countries have worked together so closely. And the factories that are in Canada are still owned by Ford or GM or whatever.
Yeah, of course.
But the fact of the matter is that it was just more efficient to kind of do it that way. It wasn't that it was cheaper to do it that way. Perhaps the workforce wasn't there in Detroit at the time when they set up the factories to build the air conditioning units or whatever it happened to be that needs to be in the other location. So he's going through hell. But the interesting thing is, prior to this having all kicked off with Mr. Trump, the group of components manufacturers in Canada got together and said, technically, with all the components that we're making, we could make our own car. And don't forget, Canada does not have its own indigenous car manufacturer. Hasn't needed to, because of the relationship with the US.
Never has, right? I don't ever recall a native Canadian vehicle. Yeah.
No, nor do I. I think they made a couple of aircraft, I think, back in the day. And obviously they've got, Bell.
They made the Aero. As soon as I read that you were the Aero project, and now I realize it's certainly inspired by it. For all the av geeks out there, look up the Aero. It's a fascinating story. It was an interceptor. It was supposed to intercept nuclear bombers coming over the Arctic from the Soviet Union. Just a fascinating thing. And it was real. It was happening. It was flying. And then some new government came in, budget cuts, and they killed the whole project. And I know for Canadian pride, that thing really hurt. So maybe what you're working on right now is the reincarnation of bringing that pride back again.
I think there's a connection between the two. And by the way, that route over the Arctic, I think the Russians have recently just dusted off some of those old charts to have a look and see if it's still feasible.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, nervous times for everybody. But yeah, so the idea was to get all these various different manufacturers of components together and say, right, let's build a car. Let's do our own as a showcase. Let's do it as a showcase. And so they did, and they produced the Aero 1.0, which was the version that was shown to people. It was a prototype show car, and on the basis of having worked in the automotive industry for a long time and having produced a lot of prototype show cars, I know what's underneath it, and you wouldn't want to put that into production, but it's the first stage. And what's happened now is they've received a little bit more budget, and they're moving forward now to produce 2.0 and then moving towards eventually a 2.5, which is essentially going to be almost a pre-production model. Are they going to put it into production? Who knows? I mean, my recommendation has always been yes, because I'm a car guy. It's kind of interesting that the Chinese are buying Chinese cars. And you said that you talked earlier about the fact that, the Porsches and Mercedes and BMWs and Teslas are not selling as well in China as they were. Initially, they were. Now that's dropped quite heavily, because I think that the Chinese realize that, okay, a brand's a brand, but, if it's going to be $20,000 less, I'm going to have $20,000 more in my pocket to go and buy Samsung refrigerators that tell me to order more eggs. So they're kind of more keen on that, and they don't go out and polish the car on Sundays and have people walk past going, "Oh, you could only afford that then."
Yeah, right.
It's less. Yeah, it's less of an issue. They don't have that kind of sort of pecking order in the way they do things. But essentially, the idea of buying something from a nationalistic point of view, it's not a bad thing. I mean, Volkswagen sell a lot of Volkswagens to Germans. BMW sell a lot of BMWs to Germans. Mercedes send a lot of Mercedes to Germans, and they do it because they believe in their national brand. And I've worked for companies that have had involvements in that back in the day, with companies like Brabus, and I was going backwards and forwards to Bottrop in Germany and meeting Brabus customers. And I'd say to a customer, "Oh, you're buying a new Brabus?" "Yeah, I'm buying a new Brabus. I buy a new one every year." "Okay, how long have you been buying Mercedes?" since I was 17, and they wouldn't
Yeah.
think of buying anything. Would you buy a Jaguar? No, I would not buy a Jaguar. Why would I want to buy a Jaguar? They just literally would have no interest in buying anything other than a German product. German is good, German is reliable, German is everything they want it to be. So that nationalistic side of things is actually pretty positive. The only country in the world that's kind of literally hived off most of its automotive industry is the UK. We sold Bentley, we sold Rolls-Royce, we sold Jaguar, we sold Land Rover.
Mm-hmm.
We sold Morgan, we pretty much every car manufacturer that we had
Sold
here
it
in the
all.
UK. We sold it all. We just, does anybody want to hang on to the silver? Nah, don't worry about it. Just get rid of everything. And that was kind of the mentality, which I think is a problem. But there's a backlash on that now. And I think that, as I said to the board the other day, I think that if you produced a Canadian car which represented Canadian values as you have them now and as you see them, you would have a guaranteed sales opportunity of X number. If you want more than that, you'll probably have to do a little bit more to kind of, develop the brand or whatever it happens to be and do some export or what have you. But again, there's a lot of Canadians all over the world. And if they were given the opportunity to buy a Canadian car, they probably would. So, yeah, so it's an interesting project.
It seems like it's from a realistic standpoint, just the fact that all the parts are already manufactured in Canada. This has the potential to become reality. There's so many show cars that we know, as you mentioned there, underneath, it's not ready for production, and scaling things up and actually building the car at scale is apparently the most challenging part of the process. So at least Canada has a head start there. So I'm totally rooting for them.
It absolutely does. The quality of the cars they produce, obviously for their American factories or the Canada-based factories that are producing for US companies, and also obviously they've got a number of Far East companies, Toyota are there and Honda are there and what have you. The quality of cars they produce is exceptional. They are one of the top quality producers in the world in terms of automotive.
All right. So switching back to Austin real fast, are you manufacturing those in the UK?
Yeah, well, we started off with a strategy which made a lot of sense initially. Perhaps in hindsight, we might have to kind of, slightly change that. And that is that we went for a contracted manufacturer out of India. And, India, again, is a country that you kind of look at as a potential competitor to China in terms of the ability to produce something at a relatively low cost. And one of the things that we were keen to do is actually produce the car at a low cost. So we weren't sort of penalizing people for having something to enjoy. The target market is very much, if I'm being brutally honest, it's probably guys and probably guys more than women in their kind of 50s and 60s who turn around to their wives and go, do you know something? I remember back in the day when I had a Harley Davidson, how much fun I had on that. I'm going to go and buy another Harley. And she turns around and says, no, you're fucking not. You'll die on that. And your insurance is nowhere near good enough. So you can forget that, pal. So they go, okay, what else can I get that's going to be loads of fun? I can keep in the garage, and I can go in and kind of wash it on a Sunday or whatever and make it all look pretty and shine it up and buy little bits and pieces for it and stick little chrome bits on it. And I also get to dress up when I go out in it. Key point.
Yes. Yeah, fair.
So the idea was this: so you can wear a flying jacket and goggles and all this kind of stuff, and you can turn up at the bar or the pub or wherever and go down to the seaside and just look really you probably think you look cooler than you are.
Scarf. Need the scarf.
The scarf, yeah. You've got to have the silk scarf kind of, just sort of like the old RAF officer, just kind of wafting in the breeze behind you. But yeah, so that was kind of the idea, the idea behind that and that kind of target market. India's a great place for price. So we're looking at the possibility of manufacturing here in the UK. But it's not manufacturing, it's assembly. This is not a complicated car to put together. And that's half the fun of it, is that it's simple.
Can you still do that in a cost-effective manner? I mean, that's the whole reason why everyone offshored in the first place.
Yeah, you can do it in a cost-effective manner because everybody seems to forget how much it costs to move shit these days. Back in the good old days, I remember I used to send containers full of Lamborghinis from Italy across to the States. And the entire container would cost me $2,500 to send the whole container, 40-foot container. Okay, it would now cost $25,000 to send the same container.
Yeah. Times are changing. So what's the future now for Austin? Obviously, this is a niche product, and it certainly, I'm the target audience. It speaks to me. Do you have any grander plans to scale up and go bigger?
Yeah, we do. So essentially what we've got is the Aero is the first car. We're going to use the platform to produce a car called the Aero 75. The 75 is more a day-to-day usable car. It's going to have a hood, it's going to have a heater, it's going to have AC, it's going to have a proper windscreen with windscreen wipers. It's a car that you can get in and use and take it out, all year round if you want to. And I love eccentric people who will do that. And again, the volumes are relatively low. We're not looking to go and win any awards for punching these things out one after the other. And they'll just be great cars running around. So that's a 75. We're looking to develop a thing called the Vitesse, which is a single seater. It's a monoposto. It's literally much thinner.
Oh, wow.
And it's got a drive shaft that runs down from the front down to the rear axle. A lot more power. That's not being built under L7E. We're looking at the possibility of that for a racing series, and that's the one with the gearbox in it. So you'll actually physically have to drive that car. Skinny tires, lots of torque, lots of power. 0 to 60 miles an hour, sub 2 seconds. If we can get the tires to grip.
Wow, fantastic.
So just absolutely bonkers. And every single corner you come to, you can just steer on the throttle. So just literally have the car moving just on the throttle, which will be just great fun. Really benign. It's not going to bite you in the backside, but it'll just be really nice and really good fun. And the challenge will be to drive it quickly, smoothly, which was always the challenge to anybody involved in motorsport. If you can be quick and smooth, you're going to win. If you're all over the place,
you're going to win races.
Exactly right.
Is there somehow you're going to incorporate a clutch into this, or is that one thing you're going to omit?
No, there's a clutch in it. Yeah.
Now that's the kind of car I want to get my hands on. That's it. That's what I miss.
It'll just be really, really good fun. And it's, and to a certain extent, because of the fact we've got so much torque and so much power in this, we'll have a little switch on the dashboard that, if you want to be completely mad, then we can put a fair bit of power through it, so we have lots of fun. But really really lightweight. So
and no traction control, I take it, either. If you're going to race these things, you're on your own when it comes to that, right?
Isn't your foot traction control? Isn't that what it's supposed to do?
I agree.
So yeah, that's what it was always for when I learned to drive. There wasn't all these buttons you could push. If you can't drive quickly, then don't do it. So that's one other product. We have a product called the 224E, which will how do I put this in a careful way without revealing too much? You'll recognize what it looks like.
Okay.
It used to be part of an interesting duo, which was called an Austin something else.
Healy, maybe, perhaps?
You could say that. I couldn't possibly comment. But we don't have that particular brand. That's still somebody else's. But essentially, the design of the car. When I worked for a brief period of time for a company called MG Sport and Racing, and MG Sport and Racing was a part of the MG Rover Group that would have been acquired by the Phoenix Consortium when BMW sold it. And we set up a part of the business called MG Sport and Racing, and we did Le Mans, and we did the World Rally Championship, and we did the British Touring Car Championship. And I was commercial director of that. We also produced some specials. We had a little MG ZR, and there was the ZS and the ZT special versions. We eventually put a Mustang V8 in the ZT, which was possibly the stupidest thing anyone ever did.
Wild,
but it was
stupid awesome.
Yeah, it was kind of bonkers. There wasn't much foot room in, because the central tunnel had to be pushed out so much to get the gearbox in. There was like this much place to put your feet, so that became kind of a bit interesting. And we produced a little car called the MG SV, which was Peter Stevens' project, and it was based off the Di Tommaso Mangusta that was originally produced a while ago.
So much fun! Oh, you worked on some really cool projects. That's wild.
Yeah. So we had that, and that gave us a really interesting sort of project to run along with. So I had fun doing that for a while. But the interesting thing is that it gives us the opportunity to produce some really interesting different cars. And as I say, the key thing, I suppose, really the mantra within the company is that the EV is not boring. In fact, it's far from boring. It's really, really exciting. And actually, if we can just wrap these cars with bodywork and some technology that almost dumbed down the technology that's available to make it a more immersive experience, and that's what we'll do.
Amazing. Before the show, Nigel, you were talking something about you had a Trump story. So with tariffs, Trump so much in the news right now. Let's hear it.
Okay. So Trump is this really divisive character that people either love or hate. And those people who don't like him literally judge everything he does incredibly harshly. And I'll leave it to everybody who's listening to kind of make a decision on that, because it's not for me to comment either way. However, I was working in Jacksonville, Florida for Lamborghini USA. I was vice president of sales for Lamborghini USA for a while. because we had to sort out the American market after we took over Lamborghini in the early 90s or mid-ish 90s. And I got a phone call from Mar-a-Lago, and they said, Mr. Trump would like to test drive a Lamborghini Diablo, but he doesn't want to do it with a dealer. He wants to do it directly with the importer in the US. Would you please organize that for him? So I said, yeah, okay, no problem. I'll go and do it. So I ended up getting a car organized to be delivered down to Mar-a-Lago, and I flew down to Fort Lauderdale or whatever it was, and went up and went into Mar-a-Lago, and I stood there by the car, and at the prescribed time, this individual came out of the front of the club with his entire entourage, and they walked towards me, and they reached the top step, and he carried on, and they just stopped. They just stayed where they were. And he walked down the step and he put his hand out and he said, hi, I'm Donald Trump. And I thought, Jesus, yeah, I know that. So I shook his hand and he said, so this is the car, is it? And I went straight into salesman mode, opening the doors and showing him around. And it was a Diablo VT. It wasn't super special at the time, but it was a nice car. And I showed him around. He said, so let's go for a test drive. And I said, great. So he got in the driver's side and I got in the passenger side, and he started the car up and I talked him through all the various controls and stuff. And he looked at the gear shifter in the middle and he went, oh, it's a stick. And I said, yeah, it's a stick shift. And he said, I'm not very good at driving stick. He said, I tell you what, you drive it. You drive it. So we got out the car and we swapped over, and I got in the driver's side and he got in the passenger side, and off we went, and he kind of showed me where to drive, and we drove around for around, I don't know, it must have been around 40 minutes. And he was absolutely, I hate to say this, but he was absolutely charming. He was delightful. He was thoroughly enjoyable company. He was pleasant. He was funny. He was witty. He was just a nice kind of cool guy to hang out with. And this is a long time ago. And, anyway, we get back to Mar-a-Lago, and he gets out of the car and he says, oh, this is fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. And he turns on his heel at exactly the time that I'd had, been prescribed. I'd been told this is the window, and exactly to the second, turned on his heel and he walked up the steps and into his waiting entourage, and off he went. And I went running up the stairs after him because I thought, he's my best buddy now. We've been hanging out for an hour. He's been telling me about things, we need to go and have a beer now. And as I'm running up the stairs, the stairs, this girl turns around and she says, where are you going? And I said, well, I've just been doing my thing with Don, and we've just been hanging out. And she said, no, you're done. That's it.
Yeah. Have a great day.
Over.
Ta-ta.
And that was the end of that. Yeah. We sold him 2 cars, which was great. And I've got some great pictures of him with the car.
All right. So you got that out of it.
He bought 2 cars, but I just thought he was a buddy for life, and he just let me down really hard,
It's because unfortunately you weren't a Russian double agent, right? So you couldn't woo his
or a
favor.
Russian double D. If I'd been a Russian double D, I would have been fine. But,
fair enough.
Well played, Nigel.
Fair enough.
But yeah, it was
amazing.
It was interesting to see, to see what the man has become. It's a good story. It's a good anecdote for dinner.
Well, yeah, in my front row seat here, living in New York, and obviously his whole family, they're from Queens to Manhattan, they've been New York from the word go. He owned a football team in what was called the USFL back in the 80s. And obviously he was, all the casinos. He was always hungry for the spotlight. He had charisma. He was fun. He was a little bit of a clown, I always felt. Not a man to be taken seriously.
Yeah, absolutely, which is probably the reason why I got on.
Well, now how do you feel about that, Rob, with your stock portfolio? How seriously are you taking him now, friend?
Bad subject. Bad topic here, Scott.
Yeah, right.
Between my portfolio and my Tesla holdings, yeah, it's been a pretty rough couple of weeks.
You probably should have tied a rope around that and hung on to it
right now.
Yeah, right.
Well, I got no choice now. So, yeah, I'm in it. Ride or die with Tesla. All right. Wonderful. Listen, Nigel, this was really a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate having you on the show. That is a wrap for the UrbanEV Podcast. Really appreciate you sharing your journey from supercars to all the electric icons that you're working on today and the future ones that I believe are in the making, and showing us what's possible when history meets innovation. I really am pulling for you, and I can't wait to see what the future of Austin holds. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's passionate about the future of mobility. The road to sustainability starts at the plug, and that's why we're here. So we will see you all next week with a new episode of the UrbanEV Podcast.